October 27, 1955, Detroit, Michigan. The heart of America's automotive industry was humming with activity. Factories were running full steam ahead, churning out the iconic cars that defined the era: Chevrolets, Fords, Cadillacs, all symbols of American innovation and success. But in the midst of all this progress, something was amiss. In the heart of the city stood a towering industrial complex, the main factory of the renowned Maxwell Automotive Company, a leader in American car manufacturing. The factory was one of the most important in the city, employing thousands, churning out hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and fueling the economy of the Motor City itself. At the helm of this empire was James Maxwell, a self-made tycoon who had built his fortune from the ground up. Known for his keen business acumen and bold personality, he was as well known in the city as the cars he produced. To the people of Detroit, Maxwell was a living legend. But on that fateful October morning, Maxwell would vanish without a trace. James Maxwell had always been a man of routine. At 8 a.m. sharp, he arrived at the factory every morning, greeted by his trusted assistants, inspecting the production lines, meeting with engineers, and keeping a watchful eye on the day-to-day operations. On October 27th, his assistant, Charlotte Parker, entered his office at precisely 9:15 a.m. to inform him of an urgent meeting with a group of investors. Maxwell's desk, however, was strangely empty. Charlotte initially thought nothing of it. Perhaps he had taken an early morning walk around the factory grounds or stepped into another meeting. Maxwell was known to be a man of action, constantly on the move. But when 10 a.m. came, and still no sign of Maxwell, concern began to grow. Charlotte went to his office, hoping to find him there. She knocked on the door. No answer. She hesitated for a moment before entering. Maxwell's office was precisely as it always was, sleek, with wood paneling and walls lined with photographs of him shaking hands with dignitaries, CEOs, and union leaders. But there was something off about the room this time. The faint scent of Maxwell's expensive cigar still lingered in the air, yet the man himself was nowhere to be found. His coat was missing, his hat too, no sign of a hasty departure. Charlotte called his home, but no one had seen him. She reached out to a few colleagues. No one had spoken to him since the previous evening. As the hours ticked by, it became increasingly clear that something was wrong. By noon, police were called in to investigate his sudden disappearance. At first, the authorities thought it was a simple case of a businessman running off for some personal reason, maybe an affair or a family dispute, or even a temporary escape from the stress of his empire. But as the hours stretched into days and Maxwell's absence continued without a trace, the situation began to take on a much darker tone. Rumors began to swirl around the city. Some whispered that Maxwell had gotten involved in shady deals, perhaps with the mafia, perhaps with other industrial tycoons, or even with rival companies eager to undercut his success. Others said he'd crossed the wrong person or made enemies in places more dangerous than Detroit's boardrooms. But despite the police efforts, interviewing employees, friends, family, and business associates, nothing concrete was found. No ransom note, no phone calls demanding money, no clues pointing to foul play. James Maxwell had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. For weeks, the investigation plodded along. Detective Henry Malloy, a seasoned investigator with decades of experience, was brought in to oversee the case. But he soon found himself facing a wall. The factory had been thoroughly searched, and so had Maxwell's home. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had heard anything out of the ordinary. As months went by, the trail grew colder. By the summer of 1956, James Maxwell was officially declared missing, presumed dead. Theories floated around. Perhaps he'd been murdered and his body hidden, or maybe he had staged his own disappearance to escape mounting financial pressures. But no one knew for sure. With no body, no evidence, and no new leads, the case was quietly shelved. Life in Detroit carried on. The Maxwell Automotive Company, though shaken by the loss of its founder, continued to produce cars. And in time, Maxwell's name faded from the headlines. But as the years passed, James Maxwell's disappearance would slip deeper into the shadows, until an unexpected event in 2023 brought the long-forgotten mystery back into the light. As the years passed, life in Detroit moved on. The Maxwell Automotive Company, though shaken by the disappearance of its beloved founder, continued to thrive. New faces arrived to fill Maxwell's shoes, and the company remained one of the cornerstones of Detroit's industrial empire. The cars kept rolling off the production lines, the factory hummed with the sound of machines, and the world forgot about the mysterious businessman who had vanished without a trace. But while the outside world moved on, the factory itself would harbor secrets that no one could have imagined. The years after Maxwell's disappearance were marked by changes. The once grand factory, a symbol of his success, began to show signs of wear. In the 1980s, the building was sold to a larger conglomerate looking to modernize and expand their operations. But as they took over, they began to notice strange things, things that had been overlooked by previous owners, things that seemed to hint at a forgotten past. The building, which had always been a well-oiled machine, suddenly felt different, as though it carried the weight of memories that didn't quite add up. Employees working in the lower levels of the factory, near the old assembly lines, began to report strange occurrences. At first, it was small things, faint echoes of footsteps in abandoned hallways, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering in the dead of night. Nothing too alarming, but enough to make some workers uncomfortable. But it wasn't until a routine inspection in 2023 that the true mystery of James Maxwell's disappearance began to unravel. The new owners had begun renovations, seeking to modernize the facility and convert parts of the building into office space. As part of the upgrades, a team of contractors was assigned to tear down walls and clear old storage rooms that had been locked up for decades. One such room, located deep in the bowels of the factory, had been forgotten since the days when Maxwell himself ran the operation. It was a cold, dusty space, stacked high with old crates, broken equipment, and piles of forgotten documents. As the workers began clearing the room, they discovered something unusual, a concealed door hidden behind a stack of crates. It was small, almost unnoticeable, tucked away in a corner where no one had thought to look for years. At first, it seemed like just another forgotten storage closet, but when the workers opened it, they were stunned by what they found. Behind the door was a narrow passageway, dimly lit by a single overhead light. The passage led deep into the heart of the factory, farther than any of the workers had ever ventured. It seemed to wind down, deeper and deeper, as if it had been built to hide something. The walls were lined with old pipes and rusted steel beams, the air thick with dust and the scent of forgotten years. The workers, intrigued but cautious, followed the passage until it led to a strange, sealed-off room. The room was small but oddly well-maintained, untouched by time. The walls were bare, save for a few scattered tools and a wooden crate that had clearly been placed with care. But what caught their attention wasn't the room itself, it was what they found inside the crate. A collection of old, faded documents, and tucked carefully inside one of the folders, an envelope. The envelope, sealed with wax, was clearly old. The paper inside was yellowed with age, the ink faint but legible. It was a letter, written in a neat, precise hand. The words on the page sent a chill down the workers' spines. To those who may one day find this, if I have not returned, know that I did not vanish by choice. The future of Maxwell Automotive is in danger. There are forces at work here, forces I can no longer control. I fear for my life and for the company I built. If anything happens to me, follow the passage in the factory's lowest level. What you find there will explain everything. But beware, the truth may be darker than you can imagine. The letter was signed simply with Maxwell's initials, J.M. The workers, stunned by the discovery, immediately reported their find to the new owners. They in turn called in a team of experts, including historical researchers, forensic investigators, and old employees who had once worked alongside Maxwell. The mysterious letter, written nearly 70 years ago, had breathed new life into the long-forgotten mystery. The letter's mention of a hidden passage and a warning of danger had left everyone with more questions than answers. Why had Maxwell hidden this letter? What had he meant by forces at work? And, perhaps most chilling of all, what exactly had happened to him in those final fateful days of October 1955? The company quickly began a thorough investigation into the passageway Maxwell had described, and what they uncovered would forever change the understanding of the Tycoon's disappearance. But as they followed the trail of his cryptic words, they would uncover more than just the secret of his hidden room. They would discover a dark side of Detroit's industrial history, a side where corruption, betrayal, and power struggles intertwined in ways no one could have predicted. As the investigation into the hidden passage progressed, the atmosphere in the Maxwell factory shifted. Workers were increasingly uneasy, whispering about the strange discovery. Some joked about ghosts roaming the halls, others feared the unexplained activities were the remnants of a troubled past that refused to stay buried. But for those in charge of the investigation, there was no time for superstition. The letter was a direct call for answers, and they were determined to find them. For weeks, experts sifted through the dusty room, combing through the old documents Maxwell had left behind. The papers contained some records of business dealings, some blueprints, and technical specifications from the factory's earlier years. But buried among them were clues that made the team pause. There were handwritten notes, obscure names, and figures in Maxwell's careful hand, names that seemed familiar but whose connections were unclear. One document in particular stood out. It was a ledger detailing various transactions that didn't make sense at first glance. There were large sums of money that Maxwell had personally moved through offshore accounts, and mentions of business dealings with companies that seemed perfectly legitimate on the surface, but upon closer inspection, had ties to unsavory characters in Detroit's criminal underworld. Maxwell, it seemed, was far more involved in the darker side of the city's industrial landscape than anyone had known. The names on the ledger were linked to corrupt politicians, mobsters, and other power players who had, for decades, controlled the true heart of Detroit. The ties to organized crime were undeniable. The same gangs that once ran protection rackets for businesses across the city were now linked to Maxwell's company. His empire had grown, but so too had the number of enemies he had made. As investigators delved deeper into these findings, a chilling picture began to form. Maxwell had not just been a man building a car company, he had been an unwilling player in a game of power, one that had turned deadly. Rumors had swirled in the days before his disappearance that Maxwell had been under increasing pressure from these figures. A man of his status, once untouchable, had suddenly found himself on the wrong side of those who had helped his success flourish. The pressure had been mounting for months, but no one had been able to pinpoint just what had tipped the scales. But then, investigators uncovered a set of personal letters Maxwell had written to his wife, Eleanor. These letters painted a completely different picture of the man. They were filled with fear not of his rivals in business, but of something far more sinister. He wrote of threats against his life, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, and anonymous warnings delivered by strangers in the street. He spoke of feeling watched, of never being alone, even in his own home or office. There was a certain desperation in his words, as if he knew the walls were closing in around him. On October 26th, the day before his disappearance, Maxwell wrote his final letter to Eleanor. In it, he mentioned that he had a meeting planned for the next day, a meeting that would determine the future of the company. He didn't go into detail about who the meeting was with, but he was clear about one thing. He feared for his life. The letter ended abruptly with the words, "If you don't hear from me by tomorrow, don't wait. Leave." Maxwell's handwriting, once steady and assured, was now shaky and hurried. The next morning, October 27th, he was gone. No sign of a meeting, no warning, only the faint scent of his cigar lingering in the air of his office and the faintest echo of his final plea to his wife. He had disappeared as if swallowed by the city itself. As the months went by, Eleanor Maxwell tried to hold it together. She kept up appearances, but those close to her noticed the change. She withdrew from social events, stopped attending church, and became a shadow of the vibrant woman she had once been. She refused to believe that her husband had disappeared by choice. But there was no sign of him, no ransom demands, no clues, no phone calls. Her grief turned into a gnawing suspicion. Was it possible that James had been murdered? If so, who would do such a thing, and why? The investigators, now staring at a mountain of evidence, had one question they couldn't answer. Why had Maxwell gone to such extreme lengths to hide the truth about his involvement with organized crime? As they dug deeper into the mysterious business dealings, they found that Maxwell had been part of a covert power struggle between rival car manufacturers, each one vying for dominance in Detroit. What had been a simple fight for market share had grown into something darker, as shady deals and betrayals festered in the background. The auto industry, once seen as the epitome of American innovation, was also a battleground for control over the city, with powerful figures willing to do anything to maintain their position. Maxwell's knowledge of these secrets was his downfall. By 1955, he had become a target, not just for the underworld figures he had crossed, but also for those within the industry who wanted him out of the way. His connections to the city's most dangerous criminals had once been an asset, but now they had become his curse. One name came up repeatedly in the investigation: Vince Mancini, a notorious Detroit mob boss whose influence in the city stretched across both legitimate and illegitimate business sectors. Mancini had long been rumored to have a stake in several automotive companies, and it was said that Maxwell's success had come at the cost of crossing Mancini's interests. Maxwell had always denied any connection to the mafia, but the evidence suggested otherwise. It was Mancini's name that had appeared most often in Maxwell's business ledgers, often in cryptic transactions that didn't sit right. The more the investigators dug into Mancini's activities in the 1950s, the more they began to see the sinister connection between the mafia and the growing automotive industry. It was a connection that in some ways had been sealed in blood. The auto industry had been a breeding ground for criminal syndicates looking to profit from every inch of production, from manufacturing to shipping. Whoever controlled the factories controlled the city. As they pieced together the puzzle, investigators began to suspect that James Maxwell had learned too much about the criminal underworld's operations. His sudden disappearance, his vanishing without a trace, seemed less like a kidnapping and more like a calculated removal, one that involved powerful figures who knew exactly how to cover their tracks. The hidden passage, the letter, and the mysterious documents were only the tip of the iceberg. What awaited them in the factory's shadowy depths would reveal far more than just Maxwell's fate. It would uncover a conspiracy that had been buried for decades, waiting for someone brave enough to unearth it. The deeper the investigation into Maxwell's disappearance went, the more tangled the web became. The discovery of the hidden passage had been a shocking revelation, but it was nothing compared to the secrets that lay waiting inside it. The passage itself seemed like a relic from another time, a forgotten route, an unsung corridor that had been sealed off for reasons no one had been able to explain. Yet it wasn't just the passage that intrigued investigators. It was what it led to. Beyond the hidden door, past the narrow, rusted corridor, lay a room that defied all expectations. It was small, almost cramped, yet meticulously maintained, as though someone had taken great care to keep it untouched. Dust had not settled thickly on the floor, and the air seemed almost still, unnaturally so. Inside, investigators discovered old crates, some broken, others still sealed, piled haphazardly against the walls. It was as if this room had been forgotten in time, left to collect dust and memories. But what truly caught their attention was the wooden crate that lay near the center of the room. This was no ordinary crate. It was old, its wood weathered, but its placement was deliberate. The investigators carefully opened it, expecting to find nothing more than scraps of old paperwork, forgotten blueprints, or perhaps tools long left behind by previous generations of workers. Instead, what they found was far more startling. A collection of personal papers, ledgers, and a letter from James Maxwell himself. Maxwell's handwriting was unmistakable, even after all these years. The contents of the letter were as cryptic as they were chilling. It was clear from his words that he had known he was walking a dangerous line in his business dealings. Maxwell had always been a man of control, but here, in this letter, his desperation was palpable. The letter began with a warning to whoever might one day find it. There are forces at work that I can no longer control. They are in every corner of this city, and they are watching. The rest of the letter was a mix of business jargon, the names of people involved in shady dealings, and mentions of secret meetings. But what truly stood out was a chilling line near the end. If you find this letter, understand this. My disappearance was not a choice. There are hands that pull the strings here in Detroit, and they won't stop until they've silenced me for good. The letter, dated October 26, 1955, just one day before Maxwell vanished, was a haunting document. It painted a portrait of a man who had gone from being a celebrated industrialist to someone cornered, trapped by forces beyond his control. But there was one more detail in the letter that would become crucial. Maxwell spoke of a hidden room, one deeper within the factory, a room that would hold the answers to everything. Follow the passage in the lowest level, the letter said. What you find there will answer all your questions, but it will also bring danger. The truth is a dangerous thing. With this new lead in hand, the investigation intensified. The team of experts, now joined by historical researchers, former employees, and local authorities, began to follow Maxwell's cryptic instructions. They searched the factory's lower levels with renewed purpose, retracing Maxwell's steps, looking for anything that had been hidden, anything that had been kept from the public eye. They examined every inch of the space where the factory's past seemed to linger, a place forgotten by the modern world, but very much alive in the memories of those who had been part of it. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon a second hidden door, a door that had been sealed off with thick layers of cement and plaster. It was tucked away behind a stack of old industrial equipment, far from the regular inspection areas of the factory. This door, unlike the first, had been intentionally concealed, as if to ensure no one would ever discover what lay beyond it. With some difficulty, the door was breached. Behind it, a hidden chamber awaited, a large, eerie room far more imposing than the first. The air was thick, musty, and the flickering light from their torches revealed rows upon rows of old filing cabinets, each packed with documents, ledgers, and papers that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. The room was a time capsule of sorts, a place that seemed to store not only Maxwell's legacy, but the very fabric of the city's industrial underworld. As investigators sifted through the documents, they began to uncover the true extent of Maxwell's involvement with the darker forces of Detroit. There were detailed records of secret meetings with mobsters, politicians, and corporate rivals, arrangements that seemed innocent enough on paper, but had far more nefarious implications when pieced together. Some of the documents even contained the names of individuals who had been connected to several mysterious disappearances in the city, individuals whose ties to the city's mafia ran deep. But it wasn't just the business dealings that stood out, it was the mention of a final transaction. Hidden within one of the ledgers was a cryptic note, signed with Maxwell's initials, that read, "The deal is set. Mancini's men are coming for me. They won't stop until I'm gone. If something happens to me, the company must be handed over to them." Mancini, the name that had surfaced again and again throughout the investigation, the same mob boss who had been linked to some of the most powerful people in the city. People who would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on Detroit's automotive empire. It became clear that James Maxwell had been caught in the middle of a battle for control, a battle between the legitimate and the illicit forces that ran the Motor City. He had built his fortune by playing the game, but in the end, it had become clear that there were rules he couldn't break. Maxwell had likely known too much, seen too much, and in his final days, he had made the desperate decision to try to escape before the very powers he had allied with turned on him. Maxwell's last moments, his fear, his final act of hiding the truth were now unfolding before investigators in this hidden room. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. But as they pieced together the narrative of Maxwell's demise, a chilling thought crossed the minds of those involved. Had Maxwell's death been an accident, a violent act of revenge, or something far more calculated, orchestrated by those with far-reaching power? The hidden passage, the secret rooms, the mafia ties, they painted a picture of a man who had been both a victim and a pawn in a larger, darker game. The investigation had uncovered Maxwell's desperate attempts to protect not only his company, but his own life. But in the end, it seemed that even his considerable influence could not save him from the forces that had closed in around him. The investigation was now at a crossroads. The more the team uncovered, the more complicated Maxwell's life seemed to have been. Once, he was a titan of Detroit's automotive industry, a man who built an empire with nothing but his own hands. But now, as they unraveled the secrets he had kept hidden, it became clear that the empire he'd built was not as unblemished as it appeared. Beneath the shine of his success, there was a dark and murky underworld, a world of crime, deceit, and betrayal. As investigators pored over the newly uncovered documents, they began to notice patterns, subtle but undeniable. There were more references to Mancini's name, too many to ignore. There were names of men whose criminal activities were well known, and some who were still alive, still wielding power in the city. But it wasn't just the names that raised alarms, it was the deals. Maxwell had been involved in shady transactions, deals that had involved large sums of money funneled through seemingly legitimate businesses. On the surface, they looked like ordinary business arrangements, but the further they dug, the more they realized that these deals were carefully orchestrated to disguise something much more sinister. One document, a financial ledger from 1954, listed a transaction that seemed completely out of place. It was a large sum of money transferred to an offshore account in Switzerland with no explanation. The amount was substantial, enough to suggest that Maxwell was not just playing with the money of a single company, but perhaps financing something far larger. A conspiracy, perhaps, a political power play, or worse, a dangerous alliance with criminal elements that reached far beyond the borders of Detroit. It was clear that Maxwell's empire had not been built solely on hard work and innovation. It had been built on alliances, some of which Maxwell may have regretted forming. The deeper investigators dug into his business dealings, the more they uncovered his connections to figures whose ambitions were far darker than his own. Some of the names were still active in Detroit's criminal world, figures who controlled everything from construction to labor unions, from street gangs to politicians. Maxwell had been entangled with these people for years, and the deeper he went into their world, the harder it became to disentangle himself. But Maxwell hadn't just been a willing participant. There were signs that, as his business grew, he had started to question his relationships with the underworld. The letters to his wife, Eleanor, spoke of growing fear of betrayal, of becoming a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. And it wasn't just the mafia that had him worried. Maxwell was well aware of the mounting tensions between the larger auto manufacturers in Detroit. He had been, unknowingly or not, a part of an industrial war, a war where winning meant more than just market share. It meant power, control, and survival. As investigators continued to sift through the trove of documents, something else caught their attention. A series of coded messages in Maxwell's personal notes. At first glance, they seemed like gibberish. But after careful analysis, they realized they were directions. Directions to a final confrontation, perhaps, or to something that Maxwell believed would protect his company, his family, and his legacy. These messages referred to a location deep within the factory, one that hadn't been seen in decades, a place that even the oldest employees didn't remember. Following these clues led them to the darkest corners of the factory's forgotten floors. And as they followed the trail left behind by Maxwell, they found themselves standing before a thick, rusted door that hadn't been opened in over 40 years. This door, like the others, had been deliberately hidden, covered up with layers of metal and stone. It was as if Maxwell had wanted this place to be lost forever. Yet, somehow, it had been preserved, just as Maxwell's legacy had been preserved, if only in secret. With a heavy sense of anticipation, the investigators finally broke through. Behind the door lay a cavernous space filled with old machinery, broken parts, and piles of discarded equipment. But in the far corner of the room, they discovered something that took them completely by surprise, a set of meticulously preserved blueprints for a project that had never seen the light of day. The blueprints were for a car, an experimental design, something Maxwell had been working on in secret. But this car wasn't just another model in the Maxwell line. It was an entirely new design, something that would have revolutionized the automotive industry. This was Maxwell's last great vision. The blueprint called it the Phoenix, and its design was ahead of its time, incorporating technologies that wouldn't be seen in mass production for decades. But the most shocking part was not the car itself, it was the timing. The Phoenix was supposed to have been the vehicle to usher Maxwell into the next phase of his company's dominance. But something had gone wrong, something that had put it on the shelf, buried and forgotten. And now, here it was, hidden away in the very factory that had once been his empire. The car that could have saved Maxwell, but had instead become a symbol of his ultimate downfall. The investigators stood in awe, their minds racing with questions. Why had Maxwell kept such a revolutionary project secret? Had it been too dangerous for public eyes? Or was it just another way for him to protect himself from the looming threats that surrounded him? The deeper the investigation went, the more the pieces began to fit together. Maxwell had been trapped not only by his own ambition, but by the forces that controlled the city, a network of powerful individuals, who saw him as a pawn in a much larger game. In the end, it seemed that Maxwell had been consumed by the very empire he had built, torn between the legitimate world of business and the shadowy underworld that had lurked behind it all. As investigators continued to unravel the mystery, it became increasingly clear that Maxwell's disappearance had been anything but random. It was a calculated move, orchestrated by those who had once been his allies, now turned enemies. They had buried him, both figuratively and literally, and in doing so, they had hidden the last remnants of his legacy, a legacy that, if brought to light, could have toppled the very foundations of Detroit's industrial power. The Phoenix was not just a car, it was a symbol of what could have been, of what Maxwell had lost. But the question remained, was it too late to uncover the truth behind his disappearance? As the investigation continued, the pieces began to fall into place, slowly, methodically, but undeniably. Maxwell's empire, built upon the engine of Detroit's industrial power, was now exposed for all its flaws. What had once seemed like a story of success was now a tale of betrayal and hidden alliances. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became. Maxwell had been the victim of forces far greater than his own ambition. The Phoenix, with its revolutionary design, had once been the key to Maxwell's future. It was a car that could have put Maxwell's company at the forefront of the automotive industry, propelling him past his rivals and cementing his place as a true titan. But instead, the project had been left to rot in the shadows of his own factory, hidden away in a forgotten room and buried under layers of secrecy. Why had Maxwell not taken this idea public? Was the risk too great? Or was it because of something darker, a fear that had kept him from pushing forward, from taking the bold step that could have saved him? The answer lay not in the car itself, but in the network of power players that Maxwell had unknowingly or willingly entered into. It was becoming increasingly clear that Maxwell had become a target not just from rival manufacturers, but from those who controlled Detroit's underworld. The mafia's influence over the city, so often invisible yet so omnipresent, had wrapped itself around Maxwell's business dealings. These figures, some in the open, others hiding behind layers of bureaucracy, had used Maxwell for years, and when the time came, they had cast him aside. Maxwell had known too much. His success had drawn him into a web of corruption, and once he had glimpsed the full extent of the criminal machinations running through his empire, there was no turning back. In his final days, Maxwell had tried to extricate himself to protect both his family and his legacy. He had made desperate plans, but by the time he realized the depths of the forces at play, it was already too late. In the documents they had found, the final, chilling message, Maxwell's warning about Mancini's men, was a desperate plea for survival. It wasn't just the mafia that was after him, it was the entire system of power and corruption that he had become entangled in. His role as a businessman had made him a valuable asset, but his knowledge of the dirty secrets that lay behind the doors of his factory made him dangerous. And in the world of organized crime, anyone who becomes a threat, no matter how powerful, is a liability. The deeper the investigators dug, the more they uncovered about the lengths to which those in power would go to maintain control. The mafia's reach extended far beyond Detroit's streets and into the very boardrooms of the city's most powerful companies. It was a system of control, a system that allowed certain men to profit immensely, while the rest of the city, workers, entrepreneurs, even politicians, were caught in its grip. Maxwell, it seemed, had become a casualty of this system, a man who had thought he could play by the rules of both the business world and the criminal underworld. But in the end, those rules were not meant to be played. They were meant to be obeyed. And Maxwell had not obeyed. As the investigation progressed, the team began to uncover disturbing evidence that Maxwell's disappearance had been meticulously planned. His sudden absence, though initially thought to be the result of an accident or a personal issue, was looking more and more like a well-coordinated act of removal. His enemies, Mancini and his associates, had left no room for error. Maxwell had been carefully isolated, removed from the public eye, and erased from the company he had founded. His disappearance was not just about eliminating a threat to their power, it was about sending a message to others who might dare to cross the line. And so, Maxwell had been silenced. As the investigation began to piece together the final details of the plot against him, investigators came across one last chilling revelation. Buried within a collection of old photographs was an image of Maxwell standing with a group of men. At first, the photograph seemed innocuous, just another image of the businessman in a social setting. But as the team examined it more closely, they noticed something strange. One of the men standing beside Maxwell was Vincent Mancini, the notorious mafia boss who had been linked to Maxwell's business dealings all along. But there was something even more telling in the photo. Maxwell was not just standing next to Mancini, he was standing in front of the same set of blueprints that would later be called the Phoenix. It wasn't just a casual meeting, it was a show of power, a way for Mancini and his allies to remind Maxwell who was truly in charge. And as the photo was examined further, one particular detail jumped out. The date stamped on the corner of the picture, October 25, 1955, just days before Maxwell's disappearance. The realization hit the investigators like a ton of bricks. Maxwell had been aware of his fate. The photo confirmed it. He had known that his time was running out. He had met with the very men who would later ensure his removal, standing right next to the design for the car that could have made him untouchable. But instead, it became a symbol of his ultimate defeat. The investigation had uncovered more than just the mystery of Maxwell's disappearance. It had revealed the full extent of his entanglement with forces far beyond his control. What had once seemed like a simple case of a missing businessman was now a story of betrayal, power struggles, and a city where the lines between industry and organized crime had blurred beyond recognition. And Maxwell, once a man who built his empire with ambition and grit, had become just another casualty of that twisted system. Maxwell's final days were not a mystery of mere happenstance. His disappearance had been orchestrated by those who had sought to control him, those who had turned his own success into a weapon against him. And now, nearly 70 years later, the truth had finally come to light. Maxwell had been a victim of the very empire he had built. As the investigation reached its final stages, the truth behind James Maxwell's disappearance became undeniable. The web of corruption, deceit, and violence that had once formed the backbone of his empire was now fully exposed. Maxwell's life, his ambition, and his legacy, all of it had been shaped by the forces of power that ruled Detroit's industrial landscape. But in the end, it was these very forces that had led to his downfall. The Phoenix, the revolutionary car that could have made Maxwell a legend, stood as a haunting reminder of what might have been. It was not just a car, it was a symbol of the man Maxwell had been and the tragic end he had met. Had Maxwell lived, had he been able to push the Phoenix into production, his name would have been etched into the annals of history. Instead, it had remained hidden, forgotten in the dark corners of the factory where Maxwell had once stood at the helm of a thriving empire. But the car was more than just a failed project. It was the key to understanding Maxwell's fate. Its creation had drawn him deeper into the web of criminality, drawing the attention of powerful enemies both within and outside the business world. The Phoenix, in its futuristic design and unmatched potential, had become a threat. It had made Maxwell a target, not just for his business rivals, but for the very criminals he had once believed he could control. As investigators pieced together the final moments of Maxwell's life, they found evidence that Maxwell had been fully aware of the danger he was in. His letters to his wife, Eleanor, had hinted at his growing fears. The pressure was mounting from all sides: the mafia, the corrupt businessmen, the political forces. They all saw him as a threat, a man who knew too much and had far too much power. Maxwell had tried to protect himself, but in the end, the forces he had once befriended had turned on him. They had erased him from existence, buried him both literally and figuratively, and hidden the truth for nearly 70 years. In the final stages of the investigation, a group of historians, led by experts in Detroit's industrial history, uncovered a stunning revelation, one that would forever change the city's perception of Maxwell. They found evidence that Maxwell had secretly planned to expose the corrupt forces controlling Detroit's economy. Before his disappearance, he had arranged meetings with key figures, hoping to break free from the grip of the mafia and take back control of his company. But it seemed that those plans had never come to fruition. Maxwell had known that the mafia would stop at nothing to retain their stranglehold on Detroit. He had seen the way they operated, the way they controlled everything, from the production lines to the politicians. Maxwell had wanted to fight back, to free himself and his company from their influence. But by the time he had realized the full extent of their power, it was already too late. He had become a pawn in a game that he could not win. The final blow had come in the form of a simple betrayal. Vincent Mancini, the powerful mob boss whose name had appeared repeatedly in Maxwell's business dealings, had orchestrated his removal. Maxwell had been silenced not because of a personal vendetta, but because he had become a threat to the very foundation of the underworld that ran Detroit. The mafia's reach extended beyond the city's streets. It reached into the factories, into the very heart of the industries that had shaped the city. And when Maxwell had become too much of a liability, they had moved swiftly to eliminate him. The investigators were left with a sense of grim satisfaction. They had uncovered the truth. Every hidden room, every secret ledger, every cryptic message had led them to this point. James Maxwell had been a victim of a system much larger than himself, a system that had used him, manipulated him, and ultimately destroyed him. But the story of Maxwell's rise and fall was not just about the man, it was about the city of Detroit itself. It was about the way that power had always been concentrated in the hands of a few, and how those who sought to challenge that power were swiftly dealt with. In the end, Maxwell's disappearance was not just a story of a missing businessman. It was the story of how the powerful had maintained control, how they had shaped the city, and how they had silenced those who dared to stand against them. Maxwell had been a man ahead of his time, a visionary who had seen the future of the automotive industry, but who had been crushed under the weight of the forces that sought to control it. The Phoenix may have never seen the light of day, but the truth behind Maxwell's disappearance had finally been uncovered. The city of Detroit, once the heart of American industrial power, had lost one of its most influential figures. Maxwell had been a symbol of ambition, a man who had dreamed of revolutionizing the world. But in the end, the revolution had been silenced, buried beneath the weight of history and the power of those who ruled the city. And so, after 70 years, the mystery of James Maxwell's disappearance was solved. His name would no longer be lost in the shadows. His story, one of ambition, betrayal, and power, would be remembered. Maxwell had been more than just a businessman. He had been a man caught in the crossfire of forces beyond his control. And in the end, it was not just his company that had crumbled, but his very legacy, buried alongside the Phoenix in the factory that had once been his empire.